I want to begin this conversation about arguing with God with a stereotypical, corny Jewish joke. A Jewish grandmother is walking with her grandson on the beach when all of a sudden a large wave comes up and snatches the grandson and sweeps him out to sea. And the grandmother falls on her knees and says, "God, if you're there and you're listening, please, please, I would do anything if you would bring my grandson back to me. I'll start keeping kosher. I'll go to synagogue. I know I haven't gone in 30 years, but I'll start going now. Please, if there's anything, please bring my grandson back." And the next wave comes swooshing back onto the shore, and lo and behold, there's the grandson. And the grandmother looks up and says, "He had a hat." Now, there's something very Jewish about that joke. Is it the fact that you're only religious in an emergency and otherwise you feel like you could ignore it? Is it the fact that there's enough intimacy with this God that you could complain about the fact that he saved the child but forgot the hat that got swept away to sea? Is there less fear and awe, as we imagine, in a relation between a human and a God, and more of a kind of familiar old relationship? Or maybe it's the chutzpah to look a gift miracle in the mouth and then say, why not more? If you can bring the kid back, why not the hat? There's certainly plenty of Jewish complaints to the management that are recorded in the Torah during the Exodus. First, the Jews are brought out of Egypt, and they say, "What are we going to eat?" And so God provides the manna from heaven that they can collect every day. But after a couple weeks of that, they start complaining again. "We're sick of manna, 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 manna. We're dying here." So then he brings them birds and birds and birds. He says, "I'll bring them birds up to their necks." So finally they have some meat. They get thirsty. "We need water, we need water." So they send Moses off to get water, and Moses winds up getting in trouble the way he gets water, and then he winds up not being allowed to enter the promised land at the end of the Torah, at the end of Deuteronomy, in part because of getting them water, because they were complaining. They find Moses is gone. He's gone up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Where is he? Well, who knows if this God he planned to present to us is really real. Let's make a statue of a golden calf, and then we can worship that. There are times in the Exodus narrative that Moses is the one that gets fed up and says, "I quit, take these people and do whatever you're going to want to do with them." There are times that God gets fed up, and Moses is the one that has to talk him down. He says, "I'm going to destroy them and you're going to take over." And Moses says, No, calm down. My favorite is there's a slight change in the grammar in the Hebrew where God says, "Moses, do you see what your people have done?" It's like parents, do you know what your child has done? And Moses says, "No, they're your people." And he plays the pronoun back to remind God that, no, that you're still the parent here. I'm just the, babysitter. It's taken for granted in these stories that the Hebrews are a stiff-necked people. They're complainers and rebels who question and demand even of a God. I've sometimes joked that we've gone from being the chosen people to being the choosy people because we keep complaining and asking, but that's the case even in our ancient self-conception. Now, wouldn't you think that it's sinful to argue with a God, especially if there's only one God in charge of everything? I can imagine in a polytheistic system, you don't get what you want from Zeus, you'll go to Hera or you go to Athena. But when there's one God, there's no court of appeal, there's no lower level, there's only one address. And who are you to argue with that? Wouldn't you expect a lightning bolt or to be swallowed by an earthquake? This actually does happen to some rebels who challenge Moses, and Korach and his followers are swallowed by an earthquake. Shouldn't you be shunned by the community if you do this? But that grandmother was not afraid at all of being shunned by the community because she said what was in her heart. Now, we're not talking tonight about arguing over who really speaks for God, because you'll get prophets who argue with other prophets, and priests who argue with prophets, and prophets who argue with priests, and that's just not arguing with God, it's arguing with people who claim to speak for God. We're not talking about other people who are outside of the Hebrew tradition, who are arguing with Yahweh, like Pharaoh in the Exodus story, or the priests of Baal. These are people outside the fold. In our story, arguing with God is inside Jewish tradition. In some ways, arguing with God is actually built into any religious system once you start praying, if you really think about it. And so I have a short piece with a non-clergy person, his name is George Carlin, talking about how prayer actually could be arguing with God.
And the best thing about the Son, it never tells me I'm unworthy. Doesn't tell me I'm a bad person who needs to be saved. Hasn't said an unkind word. Treats me fine. So I worship the Son. But I don't pray to the Son. You know why? I wouldn't presume on our friendship. It's not polite. I've often thought people treat God rather rudely, don't you? Asking trillions and trillions of prayers every day, asking and pleading and begging for favors. Do this, give me that, I need a new car, I want a better job. And most of this praying takes place on Sunday, his day off. It's not nice, and it's no way to treat a friend. And I say, fine, pray for anything you want, pray for anything, but what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan. Gave it a lot of thought, decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and fuck up your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine, but if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why the fuck bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing. So to get around a lot of this, I decided to worship the Son. But, as I said, I don't pray to the Son. You know who I pray to? Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci. So I've been praying to Joe for about a year now. And I noticed something. I noticed that all the prayers I used to offer to God and all the prayers I now offer to Joe Pesci are being answered at about the same 50% rate. Half the time I get what I want, half the time I don't. Same as God, 50-50. Same as the four-leaf clover and the horseshoe, the wishing well and the rabbit's foot. Same as the mojo man. Same as the voodoo lady who tells you your fortune by squeezing the goat's testicles. It's all the same, 50-50. So just pick your superstition, sit back, make a wish, and enjoy yourself.
A bit irreverent, but I think also making an important point, that any kind of prayer on some level is asking for intervention, and many prayers actually have the form of a complaint, and maybe that's seen as a kind of argument. Now, the motive for doing this program, as actually many of the programs I do at Kol Hadash, is that I had a book I wanted to read. And so the way I read the book is I make a program about it, and then I have to read it because I have to talk about the book. So the book I wanted to read for this one is an academic book called Pious Irreverence, Confronting God in Rabbinic Judaism. It's by Professor Dov Weiss, who's at the University of Illinois, and he's actually had an interesting journey himself. He began his academic career as a modern Orthodox rabbi, working at a yeshiva called Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, which trains other modern Orthodox rabbis. And then he realized he wasn't necessarily modern Orthodox anymore. And so he shifted over into the academic world. He went to graduate school at the University of Chicago and finished his PhD there, and now has become a professor of Judaic studies and has explored rabbinic literature, but from a fascinating perspective, wanting to find out the cases where even the core rabbis of the Jewish tradition are arguing with God and complaining and asking for changes, and sometimes even telling God where he got it wrong. And he points out in the book that even traditional prayers and texts can have an element of argument in them. You know, many prayers are praise texts. God, you're so wonderful, you're so marvelous. Think about the Hadash prayer. It's all praise. There are some petitionary prayers that are asking God for healing or for justice or for redemption. Those aren't necessarily arguing. They're simply asking respectfully. And usually you start with a lot of praise and then you start asking for favors, but you always butter up first. And then there are also prayers of gratitude. Thank you for all the wonderful things you've done. Thank you in advance for all the wonderful things you're about to do. So you have those three kinds of prayers: praise, petition, and gratitude prayers. But sometimes there is an element of complaint that appears too. So our next text, this is from Psalm 22. And you may recognize the first line because it was quoted by a first century of the Common Era Jew who was being crucified by the Romans. This is a line attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. My God, why have you forsaken me? He actually says it in Aramaic, which was the translation that he would have used as a sort of working class Jew in that period. So it's originally Psalm 22. It's cited in the Jesus story, and you'll see another allusion to Jesus later in the same psalm. But when you hear the words of this song, you realize this is not just asking, this is complaining, this is arguing, this is saying you're doing something wrong. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? My God, I cry in the daytime, but you don't answer. In the night, and I'm not silent. Jumping down to verse 5, our ancestors, our fathers, they cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not disappointed, but I am a worm and no man. All those who see me mock me. They shake their heads, saying, he trusts in Yahweh. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, since he delights in him. Don't be far from me, for trouble is near. There is no one to help. Dogs have surrounded me. A company of evildoers has enclosed me. Like a lion, they have bound my hands and feet. Sometimes you'll see they have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all of my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them. They cast lots for my clothing. Also part of the crucifixion narrative in the Gospels. But don't be far off, Yahweh. You are my help. Hurry to help me. I will declare your name to my brothers. Among the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear Yahweh, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him. So it goes back and forth between the complaint and the hope and the promise of what I'll do if you do what I need you to. But there's definitely a feeling in this text of disagreement, of argument. So what do you see in this approach that might be comfortably traditional? And what do you see that is transgressive or problematic? How would a traditional thinker try to square the circle and make sense out of this? Anyone can feel free to jump in, either here or online. I'll actually just put the mic over here. If you want to jump in, you can just grab and talk.
That your suffering is part of God's plan to make you appreciate him or something like that, or it's part of a plan.
Okay, so that concept that the suffering is part of the plan, I may not see the big picture, but God does, and so it's all part of the good plan, and maybe it's designed to make you appreciate him even more. It reminds me a little bit of the joke. Why did the man hit himself on the head with a hammer? Because it felt so good when he stopped. So maybe he's giving you suffering so that you'll be so appreciative when it stops. Yeah, Larry, just use the mic.
Yeah. Is this on?
Yes.
It just, for perspective, a couple of weeks ago, the rabbi and I had a brief discussion about the Broadway show, The Fiddler on the Roof. And this entire theme is embodied in those words, you who made the lion and the lamb, would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man? Which is very much to the theme of what you're saying.
Right. So again, that's definitely a show of complaining, or at least questioning gently, right? The line of argument, what one person thinks is just making a point, the other person sees as an argument. So it really depends on your perspective and how secure you are in your position. So this is just one example coming out of the traditional canon of an argument with God. There are, of course, many other examples. Now, there are certainly sources of people who disagreed with the concept of arguing with God. They felt it was transgressive or even heretical, worthy of condemnation, or perhaps even wicked. So, for example, Rabbi Akiva is cited in sources, and he's one of the preeminent articulators of prohibiting complaining. God says, according to Akiva, do not act toward me in the manner in which others behave towards their deities. When good comes to them, they honor their gods. But when evil comes to them, they curse their gods. But you, if I bring good upon you, give thanks. And when I bring suffering upon you, give thanks. So no matter what, praise God, even if negative things happen. Because cursing God or arguing with God is looking the gift horse in the mouth, it's being ungrateful or violating the code of holiness, the covenant, and so it's More risky to do that than to simply grin and bear it. Another example is from Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, where he says explicitly, and he wants people to recite this. In fact, this is recited daily as part of the Orthodox prayer service. I believe with perfect faith that God knows all of man's deeds and thoughts, as it quotes from the Psalms. And I believe with perfect faith that God rewards those who keep his commandments and punishes those who transgress it. So even if you're suffering, don't add to your problems. You're getting punished for something you did wrong. And if you object, and if you complain, and if you transgress and blaspheme, you're just adding to the ledger of what is going to be worked out on you. And perhaps the most pithy and shortest summary of this is what is traditionally said when you hear that somebody has died. You say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge, or blessed is the judge of truth. Depends how you parse the grammar there. But the concept is that if somebody has died, it is part of the plan. You know, may God's will be done. In this version, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. And you may see sometimes if somebody posts about a death on Facebook, you'll have people writing BDE, which is just a transliteration of Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, to articulate that. In our congregation, of course, we prefer to say Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the memory of a good person is a blessing, which is also traditional. That comes from the book of Proverbs. But the traditional concept of praising God at the moment of death feels off. And the same is true with the Kaddish. The traditional Kaddish is a praise of God. It says nothing about the person who died, but that's part of that affirmation that even in your grief, even when mourning, you need to not transgress. Now, there are some rules about which prayers can and can't be said by a mourner in the first week or the first 30 days after a death. Certain praises of God are not included in that list because the thinking is you'll be too upset and you won't say it with the proper intention. So I won't make you recite too much, but there's a minimum amount of praise you do have to recite to maintain that viable relationship. So certainly there are traditional texts that do not support challenging. But if you want to pick an example of arguing with God, take a look at the book of Job. It's right there in the canon. It's part of the writings, the third part of the Hebrew Bible, and it's a quintessential example of what's called Theodicy. Theodicy is asking the question, why do bad things happen to good people? People often think, by the way, that's the title of a book by Rabbi Harold Kushner. It's not. His book is titled, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, because it's inevitable. It's not why as if it doesn't have to happen. They do happen. In fact, Kushner himself wrote the book because his son had a genetic disease that caused him to age prematurely, and I think he died at 13 or 14, and his faith was shaken by this. How could a God allow this to happen? This is not, a 40-year-old person with bad habits who is getting punished. This is a child. And so he wrote it as When Bad Things Happen to Good People. But in many cases, he's drawing on the insights that are ancient and part of the book of Job as well. Now, Job begins his process the right way. Suffering afflicts him. It's a test by God. And Job's response is this: naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach, Yehi Shem, Adonai Mevorach. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the classical theological response. God gives, God takes. It's up to God, God's will. And for all that, the next verse says, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach upon God. But then the punishments continue, because first it was just his animals and his houses and his children who were killed. But now Job himself is afflicted with sores and diseases and rashes. And his wife says to him, who probably doesn't want to sit next to him with all these diseases that he has, you still keep your integrity? Blaspheme God and die. Like, curse God and die. Give it up already. Now, the Hebrew is interesting because it doesn't say curse God. It says bless God and die. But the implication by context is curse, and they didn't want to write curse God in the text. So they put the substitute instead. But he responds to her, again, following the tradition. You talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? And for all that, he didn't say anything sinful. Now, this is chapter 2. But by chapter 3 and chapter 4 and more suffering, finally Job breaks. And he says, I wish I was never born. And who do I blame for this? He breaks me with a storm and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to catch my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If it is a matter of strength, behold, he is mighty. If of justice, Who, he says, will summon me? Though I am righteous, my own mouth will condemn me. Though I am blameless, it will prove me perverse. I am blameless. I did nothing wrong. This is not me being punished for my sins. In verse 22, it is all the same. Therefore I say, he destroys the blameless and the wicked. If the scourge kills suddenly, he will mock at the trial of the innocent. The earth is given into the hands of the wicked. He covers the face of its judges. If not he, then who is it? Now, after 35 chapters of this, and Job beginning to complain, finally Yahweh answers him. And Yahweh's response to Job is, who do you think you are? Do you know how the planetary bodies rotate in their seasons? Do you understand how the earth was formed and who controls the waters and the changing of the times and the tides? Speak to me if you have knowledge. And Job answers, I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be restrained. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered that which I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. You said, listen now, and I will speak, question you, and you will answer me. I had heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, and I abhor myself. I repent in dust and ashes. I give up. You're too big, you're too powerful for me. And then Yahweh says, but you said the right things. Job, you said the right things. And so he blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he lived to 140 years, saw his sons' sons to 4 generations. He died being old and full of days. So a happy ending. Well, what's traditional about this story and what's transgressive about it?
It's transgressive in that
God's.
Hold on. We have a speaker in the room first and then online second.
You know, the tradition, as we've spoke, is God. It's God's will. It's God's. But then he praises him at the end. So it's a very traditional story. It's just kind of gory in the middle.
Right. Although it's 35 chapters of quarreling and then.
There's a lot of novels
Happy
like that
ending.
too, where you have to wait to the end to be disappointed.
That's right. You got to have that gun has to go off. And online, please.
just the God just keeps piling it on, and and Job hasn't really done anything. It's a bet, so that's transgressive. And then you get the traditional ending of everything works out at the end, and God is good. So that's how I see the two.
One of the interesting questions about this is, what does God mean when he says, you said the right things about me? Because Job was saying, you're in charge of everything. And God says, right, I am in charge of everything. And so if you think it's bad, maybe you don't have the big view of it, but also it doesn't matter because you are down here and I am up there. After all, we know based on the frame story of this, it was unfair. Job was a good person. They were just testing him. It was a bargain between God and what's called Satan, which means like the prosecuting attorney at this stage, not quite the devil. It's a wager they're playing out. And Job is the horse they're betting on. So it really is unjust. And I think the hard lesson of Job is that it isn't fair, that life isn't fair, that sometimes it doesn't work out well. And after all, the fact that he gets more kids, does that make up for all the kids that died? Ask any parent that has lost a child and then had another child. It doesn't make up for the kid that died. In some ways, I think Job's wife is the heroine of the story because she says, enough already. Let's just be honest with who's in charge here and what we think of him. In Weiss's book, Pious Irreverence, he describes different kinds of divine challenges in rabbinic literature. There's the challenge as question, where he says, I need more information. Tell me more about this. There's a challenge as persuasion, trying to adjust the divine action to change the course of history or to change the course of the present. There's challenges blame, where you're expressing your anger against God, even if it may not make a change in what happens. There's sometimes a selfless motive that can mitigate the violation, where in one case, a rabbi complained against God, and a later rabbi said, the only reason God didn't smite him was because he wasn't complaining for himself. He was complaining on behalf of someone else. So that, because it was a pure selfless motive, it got him out of jail on that. And sometimes it depends on the status of the critic, you know. When you're going to criticize somebody, it depends on whether you know them or not. It's one of the challenges of social media. We have strangers whom we can criticize without feeling any consequence at all, and we wouldn't say that to someone we knew face to face, or someone that we had a personal relationship with or a history with. So is the critic of God a friend of God, or is that too much of a peer relationship? Is the critic a servant who has to very carefully offer any suggestions to the master? Is the critic a student who is relating to a teacher and offering an academic kind of correction? Or is it even a courtroom setting where God is the judge and you're making your argument to the judge, who is nevertheless deciding about himself? And of course, the key question that Weiss does explore at the end of his book is why? Why include these texts of argument and challenge? And there are a number of answers for this, but perhaps the most compelling is that having a God that you can argue with, in Weiss's phrase, bridges the ontological gap. The God of philosophy is very remote from Jewish life. The God of Maimonides starts the universe, maybe reveals a Torah, but is a very remote creation of pure logic. And the God of mysticism is also very far removed. There are emanations of that God into the world through justice and through mercy and through the Shekhinah, the divine presence. But in the end, the ultimate truth of God is the infinite nothingness before the world began, and we can't reach or even handle that kind of a God. So with a world that has this impersonal, remote, distant God, we need a more humanized personal experience that also means it's more criticizable. I found the same in my own dissertation on what I called modern midrash, or modern retellings of Bible stories, which similarly humanized God, made him even fallible sometimes like a character, so you could argue with him, but then it was more relatable than the ultimate distant God on a throne that's above and beyond the universe. Who wants to talk to that? That's not a relationship, that's broadcasting. So a few examples of arguing with God from the Bible and from other sources. First, we have the story of Abraham encountering the Sodom and Gomorrah disaster. Yahweh, the Hebrew God, says, will I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? And he says that Sodom and Gomorrah has a grievous sin. I must destroy them. But here is where Abraham begins his argument. Abraham came near and said, will you consume the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous within the city? Far be it from you to do things like that, to kill the righteous and the wicked, so the righteous would be like the wicked. Far from you. And then the key line, shouldn't the judge of all the earth do right, do justice? So this is a courtroom. God is judging the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham is the defense attorney. And he says, maybe some of them are righteous, and would you really destroy them? Aren't you the judge of all the universe? Can't you do justice? That's definitely arguing. That's asking for a change in the divine decree. And so God says, okay, if I find 50 righteous, I'll spare the whole place. Abraham said, well, seeing as I've already started talking, I'll add to my problem. I've taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord, though I am dust and ashes. What if there lack 5? What if we're just 5 short of 50? Will you destroy the city for lack of 5? Not for 45. What if there's only 40? Okay, for 40. And again, you hear the praise and petition style. Don't let the Lord be angry, I will speak. What if there are only 30 found there? Okay, for 30. See, I've already taken myself to speak. What if there are 20? I will not destroy it for 20. Don't let the Lord be angry, I will speak once more. What if only 10 are found there? And he said, I will not destroy it for the 10's sake. So he's gotten him down from 50 down to 10. In the end, it's moot, because they find one righteous man who's Abraham's nephew, and they manage to save him. And he isn't even perfectly righteous, because he offers his daughters to the crowd to appease them instead of having them attack the male guests in his house. So he's not a saint either. But the reality is they save Lot because he's part of Abraham's line, and the city is destroyed. The argument was moot, but the fact is an argument was made. Now, this same Abraham, a few chapters later in Genesis 22, is told to sacrifice his own son as a sign of his faith. God says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I tell you of. And what does Abraham say in response? Nothing. Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and they went up to the place. On the third day he saw the place. Abraham says to the young men who came with him, stay here with the donkey, we'll go over there and come back. And so he puts the wood for the offering on Isaac. Isaac is like a beast of burden to carry his own slaughtering device. And Abraham takes the fire and the knife, and they go together. Isaac speaks to Abraham and says, my father, here I am, my son. Here is the fire and the wood. Where is the lamb? And Abraham says, God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So even then, he's not moved by his son's statement to say, wait a minute, what am I doing here? He even disguises it from his son. And he says, don't worry, God will provide the lamb. Although one reading of this actually changes that comma in that clause to a colon. God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, colon, my son, who is the burnt offering. You could read it. There's no punctuation in the Hebrew, so you can read it different ways. They finally get to the place. Abraham builds the altar, ties up his son, puts him on the altar. That's why, by the way, it's called the binding of Isaac in Jewish life. It's not the sacrifice of Isaac because he doesn't get killed. It's the sacrifice of Isaac in Christian iconography and images because it prefigures the sacrifice of Jesus, where a father does kill his son in that story. So in our version, it's the binding of Isaac. And Abraham stretches out his hand. He takes the knife to kill his son. You see the sort of slow motion moment happening. And then the angel intervenes and says, Abraham, Abraham. He says again, here I am. Don't do anything. So here's an Abraham who doesn't argue at all. Noah as well is called righteous, and he doesn't argue against the flood, which also kills hundreds, thousands of innocent children and cows and, all the other animals beyond number one and number two. So here again, even in the Bible, we have these sources of arguing with God. And Weiss's book is more focused on the rabbinic literature and what he calls protest ventriloquism, where the rabbis have an argument with God. They see something that God has done in the biblical literature or in their own times, and they don't necessarily want to say, Rabbi Shalom says, you're wrong, God. That might be too much. But if Moses says, you're wrong, God, that's what he calls protest ventriloquism. We can make the Bible characters have the argument with God. They're already holy people, and they have a closer relationship with him, so maybe they can get away with it. So there's a famous story here where Moses actually teaches something to God. This is an instant where Moses said something before God, and he responded, you have taught me something. When God says in Exodus chapter 20, I visit the guilt of the parents upon the children to the third and the fourth generation. Moses says, Master of the world, how many evil people give birth to righteous people? Should they take punishment for the sins of the parents? Terach worshipped idols, and Abraham, his son, was righteous. Hezekiah was righteous, and his father Achaz was a wicked man. Right away, this should ring a bell for you. Hezekiah is living 500 years after Moses. Now, if Moses is a prophet, he can see the future. But he's saying it in the past tense here, not Hezekiah will be righteous. This is a rabbi putting words into Moses' mouth. And Josiah was righteous. His father Ammon was a wicked man. Is it appropriate for righteous people to receive lashes for the sins of their parents? And God says, you have taught me something. By your life, I will nullify my decree and establish your word. And so in Deuteronomy, when they're restating the laws, it says, parents shall not be put to death for children, nor children to death for parents. And I will write it in your name. Where they repeat the law in 2 Kings, it says, according to the book of the teaching of Moses. So here Moses teaches God. Ideally, of course, it's a rabbi using Moses to teach God. There's also a famous story of the ovens of Achnai where they're debating whether a particular oven is kosher or not. And in the end, a voice from heaven comes down to resolve the dispute. And a rabbi rebukes the voice from heaven and says, butt out. Scholars are discussing here. You have nothing to do with this. We got the Torah. It's our job to interpret it. And at the end of that story, Elijah comes down and visits with a later rabbi. And the rabbi says, what did God do at that point when he rebuked the divine voice? And it says, he smiled and said, my children have defeated me. And when your kids out-argue you, and part of you is annoyed and part of you is happy that they have reached that stage in their development, my children have defeated me. But they defeated him. They rebuked him. They argued with him and won. Now, there's even cases of rabbis who go beyond the bounds of what's allowed in Jewish life. This is the story of Elisha ben Avuya, or Acher, who is a rabbi who actually left rabbinic tradition, but has some sayings that were preserved. In some cases, by the way, his name itself was wiped out. They don't call him Elisha ben Avuya. They call him Acher, other. They won't even use his name in some of the sources, and this is one of them. What did Acher see that made him go wrong? It is said that once, while sitting and studying in the valley of Gennesar, he saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on the Sabbath, take the mother bird with the young, and descend in safety. This is opposite to what the Torah says to do. At the end of the Sabbath, he saw another man climb to the top of the same tree. A snake bit him and he died. Elisha said, "It's written in the Torah, let the mother go, take only the young. Where is the well-being of this man? Where is the prolonging of his life?" And then another example, he says, when he saw the tongue of Rabbi Judah the baker in the mouth of a dog. If this is the reward of a tongue that toiled in the Torah, since that is so at the end of this passage, there is no reward for the righteous and no resurrection of the dead. He said, there is too much injustice in this world to believe there's any kind of happy ending that could make up for it. A famous phrase attributed to him is, leit din veleit dayan. There's no justice and there's no judge. That's it. It's a world without a God. But that's raised the question, do you need a God to be there to argue with it? There's actually a wonderful line in an essay by the American Jewish author Anne Royfey about post-Holocaust literature, where she says, you know, some atheists are really mad at God. They're still angry, even if they don't think there's anything there to argue with. Well, I want to give you a couple examples of modern versions of arguing with God, and we'll be wrapping up very soon. The first one is this piece of art by the artist Shmuel Bach, who is a Holocaust survivor, and wrote this piece. It's called The Creation of Wartime. So take a look at this. Obviously, this is an echo of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, reworked. But you'll notice there's some very interesting differences here in this version of the artwork. So what are some of the details of this painting that you notice, and what do you think they're saying about this question of arguing with God, or the place of God in the story post-Holocaust? Sorry? Well, the building is unfinished. The artwork is done. Right.
Adam, is it
God is an outline. It's not really there. It's just like the space of what's left. And even the hand, you'll notice, is hung up by wires. It's an artificial, like sculpture piece, or a piece of a mannequin or something. It's a God that isn't there, or left by, there's an absence, definitely. Well, the original version of this is the creation of Adam, right? So this is not an Adam like the Adam in the Sistine Chapel version. This is a prisoner or a soldier, or you see the bomb behind him, for example, to set the context of war, the destroyed buildings. There's a shell next to him on the far side as well, next to his right arm. The broken items there, the debris. You notice even the wall is sort of put together, makeshift fashion with branches, trees, not quite sure, but it's all sort of stapled together, nailed together. It's very rickety. You get the feeling that it's going to fall. You notice what's in the background? If you look far back, it might be hard to see on the screen. There are two smokestacks, smoke coming up from them. This is an echo of, obviously, the Holocaust, the suffering, the crematoria. And so if there's any God left, it's smoke. And remember, that was one of the visions of God during the Exodus. He was a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud or a pillar of smoke by day. But now all that's left is the dissipating smoke from those chimneys that make up the back end of that God and his absence. And here's another, oh yeah, Cindy, please go ahead.
I'm just struck by the look of apathy on the human's face, and yet still feeling compelled to respond to the nothing that's there. That kind of same sentiment of, atheists being mad at God, that, just sort of resignation and exhaustion and apathy, but yet still feeling pressured or responsible for responding.
Yeah, you almost wonder who hung that hand there that he's pointing at. He might have hung it himself just to have something to point at. And is that pointing the joy of a creation, or is that an accusatory finger? We'll see another version of that in a minute. Yes, Roger.
Yeah, well, it could be kind of a 180-degree opposite. In the Sistine Chapel, God was creating man. He was creating Adam. But here, man is kind of erasing God. As you say, he's dissipating in the smokestack and invisible only to an outline. So in the beginning, God created man, and in the end, man erased God.
Interesting. So another version of this, which Bach did, this is called Art Odyssey. And you can see, again, a similar kind of motif, but here it's more sort of falling apart. There's no live human beings here. These are statues or wooden sculptures. There's no God connecting to the person. In fact, the person's arm isn't connected to the person. It's sort of a Roman statue with the arm broken off, and then another piece is the arm sticking out. There's this wood, again, makeshift version that's pointing out into the distance. Again, you have smoke in the background. It's a common motif. And then what about this other hand at the top? It doesn't look to me like a creative finger. Looks like an accusation, blaming, right? It's your fault, it's you, it's on you to deal with this. And of course, it's pointing back at a reflection of the human figure right in front of it. So we have no one beyond ourselves to point to. Or if we do, we're again imagining we're creating something to point to have something to point to. This is actually articulated in a poetic version by Yehuda Amichai, where he writes, "I say with perfect faith that prayers preceded God. Prayers created God, God created people, and people create prayers that create God, who creates people." It's a cycle, but it's a cycle that has a beginning point. The prayer, the longing, the need, the questioning, the suffering, that was there first. And that was the prayer that led to believing in something that might help deal with that situation. Of course, at times, beliefs change, and we don't believe what we believed before, but we still have to answer the key question, what do we do now? If we think our God is an echo, if it's something that we've made for ourselves, if the suffering in the world is just too great, and we don't even feel mad anymore, what do we do next? This is a poem we use in some of our services. It's called I Do Not Ask. I used to mumble many words in the prayer book without much thought, even all wise, all good, all powerful God, until dear Clara was felled by a stroke, she who always did for others, now helpless, shorn of dignity. The contradiction of those words struck me then, forced me to shake my head over and over again. But saying no and saying nothing are not for me. I need to say yes. Yes to a soap bubble afloat in sunshine, to a newborn baby's perfect fingernails, to a child reading a first sentence, to the look of love that lights a face. I do not ask who or how, I just say yes. We all need to say yes. Saying no, being angry doesn't answer those key questions. And so I hope you've seen through this exploration of arguing with God how nevertheless there is deep meaning in life, even if we come to the conclusion that we're talking to ourselves. We know also that Judaism historically has always been more than an absolute faith based on unquestioning belief. Look at all these sources in traditional Jewish literature, from the Bible to the Talmud to modern times. We know that Jews have disagreed about God as much as they've agreed about God. The theological diversity is a feature of every period of Jewish history. We know that Jewish chutzpah has a long pedigree and knows almost no limits. As a congregational rabbi, I'm very familiar with that. And most importantly, Secular humanistic Jews have roots in Jewish tradition too. We're not only celebrated in the heretics of the Elisha ben Avuyas and the Huey al-Balhis who question the Bible, we're also part of the mainstream because whether it's Job or Abraham or Moses, there are versions of our ancestry and our storytelling that reflect the same kind of questions that we ask today. Elliot, go ahead.
So any other religions that do this, that have this love-hate relationship, so to speak?
Interesting question. Are there other religions that have a similar kind of questioning? There are sometimes strands in the religions that do this, but it is rather unique. I can't say for sure there's no one else that does it, but certainly looking at Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Hinduism maybe has a bit more of this playfulness because again, they have a polytheistic system, so the gods can be tricked, the gods can be fallible. But in a monotheistic system like Islam or Christianity, it's generally frowned upon. And actually, Christians go to great lengths, which Weiss details in his book, to try to explain away Job and to claim Job, oh, he isn't really challenging God because that would be wrong. How could he be the hero of a book that's in the Holy Bible if he's arguing with God? And they try to apologize away for Abraham because arguing with God, you're not supposed to do. That's seen as a transgression. And so that's one of the reasons why speculates that early on in rabbinic literature, they agreed with the Christians and said, no, you shouldn't argue with God. They apologize away Moses arguing. Akiva says, no, you shouldn't argue with God. You should always bless him no matter what happens. And it's only in later generations they feel more confident or comfortable to be able to have that more intimate relationship, but also a more contentious, argumentative relationship.
All right, so that's the dogma of the other religion.
Right.
So is that the Orthodox and the Jewish faith? They don't, well, how do they explain Job?
Right. So they would take sort of the surface meaning of the story as presented, that he was challenged in his faith and he failed by cursing God, and then he came back into the fold. And one of the academics' perspectives on that, though, is that the very beginning and end of the Job story might be added separately. But the original Job story was all the complaining. And it was the beginning with the test and the end with the reward was added to make it palatable, and that's why it made it into the Hebrew Bible. If it had just been the complaining, it might not have made it at all. So it was made possible to be there. But that took some interpreting and some finessing, even as the text was developing, to make it happen. But you're right, that in general, the approach is from sort of mainstream Orthodox sources is you can quibble, but in the end, you have to acquiesce.
Rabbi?
Lasting argument doesn't work. Cindy had her hand up first, and then Roger.
Because I come from a different tradition, it really depends a lot on the denomination of Christianity as to whether or not arguing with God is permissible or encouraged. The tradition in which I grew up was both selectively conservative and also very, very willing to allow those kinds of arguments. And I think that one of the differences, as far as I've observed, is in how that argument happens. With Christianity and the traditions that I come from, the argument ends up becoming more kind of a two-part thing. One is how we take, scripture and translate it and interpret it and apply it to, modern matters. And then the other would be the sort of like feelings or thoughts that you get, which get attributed to the Holy Spirit, so these arguments are very different, but still in a lot of denominations, particularly those that are more common in the West and those that are descended from Protestantism, arguing with God is much more permissible than if you were in, say, a Catholic church or a Greek Orthodox church or something like that. So it varies a lot, but it's a part of the tradition.
Right. And you also always have to wonder, what's the dynamic? What's the role of the critic versus the God? Is it as a judge or is it as a teacher that you're questioning? I don't know that you'd have very many examples of you taught me something in those traditions, but you would certainly have you're failing me now, please intervene and help, because that's again coming out of the traditional sources. Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, I had a question that Book of Job, is that in a book that was written by later authors, or because you were saying earlier they wouldn't be doing it, or is it written by the earlier authors in the Bible?
So the Book of Job is very tough to date. It's in the third section of the canon. It's not part of the first 5 books of the Torah. It's not part of the prophets. It shows up much later, even though supposedly it's set during the time of the historical books of Kings. So it's sort of hard to date. It's most likely between 500 BCE and 300 BCE, somewhere in that range. We do actually have an example of a similar kind of theodicy in ancient Babylonian literature, where someone is suffering and complains to the gods, and it's a sort of prototype of the Job theodicy that may have been a model for the writers. But we don't have enough, there's no historical references in it that help us date it in the way that some other books have. So it's a little bit harder to put a finger on it. Bill, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the story of teaching God struck me because that's the same argument about reparations and justice that we talk about today. Are we responsible for reparations of what our ancestors did, or the people who enslaved others? Why do we feel that we have to be responsible? We didn't do it. So it kind of just jumped out how current that story was.
Well, the whole question of intergenerational punishment or responsibility, do your debts die when you die? But we also know that abuse can sometimes be passed down from parent to child. Alcoholism has a genetic component and an experiential component too. We're learning all the time about how sometimes what happens in one generation doesn't stay in that generation and gets carried forward. But again, this is imagining a more cosmic punishment for this that we might find unjust. In terms of lasting responsibility, part of the reparations issue, I have to say, is not just about slavery, it's about Jim Crow. It's about redlining. It's about discriminatory admissions. That's the 1960s. That's not ancient history here. Those teenagers who were screaming at the students integrating schools, they're still alive. If they were 15 years old in 1955, they're 71, or they're 81 now for those. But if they were screaming in 1965, they're not that old. They're 71 years old. And so that's still part of today. It's not ancient history. We like to think of it, the end of the Civil War in 65 was the end in 1865, but not at all. So social responsibility has to carry on beyond one generation. After all, people are still mad at German car companies for what happened during the Holocaust. And that's even longer ago than Jim Crow. Yes, Steve.
This reminds me of a short movie I saw, and I have a copy of it back in the mid 70s. It's called Steam Bath. I don't know if anybody remembers the Bill Bixby starring, and he walks into the steam bath, and it's very calm, cool, and collected, and he starts making comments, and everybody starts arguing with him. And in the end, after all these comments, he reveals himself as God. And they argue with God. I can't remember all the bits and pieces, but I do remember that what we have discussed tonight is very reminiscent of that movie. That movie puts it all in a nutshell.
Interesting.